See, observability probably, actually, you've probably answered the question, previous one, which is, it's much more of an umbrella term. Because when you think about
are you coming around to my way of thinking,
I might
Paul?
well be, actually. I might well be.
So, Paul, I wanted to move on to talking about observability versus AIOps. Now, it's not necessarily versus, but you and I kind of have a little bit of a sort of discussion or debate going around in terms of, which one is the umbrella term, sort of AIOps or observability. It may not be either of them, but the point is that it's been a good debate, I think. So I'm glad you kind of mentioned observability a number of times in the report. I think that's really good. And as we said, yeah, we kind of differ in terms of sort of the umbrella definition. But there was one item in there which I kind of wanted to bring in because it does fit into what we're talking about, and that was there's a quote in the report, and you say legacy vendors seem stuck in time and appear to be sort of losing their mojo, and you've got kind of more startup vendors really coming into that space as things have transitioned. So explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting in the sense, and I think AIOps has been the sort of driver of this particular move. AIOps, you've got a number of startup vendors, the big pandas, MoveSofts of this world, who've sort of come in and sort of rattled the cages. And really the sort of major sort of suite vendors of suites like IBM, BMC, etc. I sort of got caught short. I mean, they're working in those silos we've talked about in the past. So they've got siloed applications working within an overall suite. And they haven't, and I think, as partly as much as anything else, they've not seen the whole IT operations management piece as being a driver of growth for them. It's something that they do as part of their other businesses. So they've rather lost focus. And then people have generally, and a lot of vendors do this, and it's not just in this sector, but have used, have jumped on the term AIOps, and I think, and we say, look, anybody who's got even the most basic algorithm seems to call their solution AIOps, and you think, she's getting, a little awkward here in the sense that everybody's calling AIOps. So to one extent, AIOps has become, the umbrella almost by default.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was on a webinar recently, and somebody was saying, and we apply AI at that point in our sort of observability platform. And then it just kept on mentioning this. And I said, what are you actually doing? Can you explain exactly what is the AI that you're, or the ML that you're actually applying, in that? Because it was just kept on throwing that term in there, but without actually explaining what is it that you're actually doing? What does the algorithm go off and do and produce and provide and visualize, so that we can actually say, okay, yeah, that does, I can't figure that out, but the system can do that, or this particular solution can do that for me, and that's a great point. But we're just saying, oh yeah, and we just do AI and ML, it just doesn't make any sense. You need to kind of actually say, what is it that you are doing?
Yeah, so again, comes back to the fact that, it's this event correlation, it's pulling it all together, it's using the machine learning to sort through and say, where's the correlation between, what's happening on the network, what's happening in the server estate, what's happening in the app, but also being fairly honest too and open about the way in which the algorithm's been put together. I think there's a trust problem that people have got around AI. When you go talk to IT operations people and you start mentioning AI ops, you see the sort of eye rolling start fairly rapidly. Because life is different for them, and it's like, oh good, here we go again. So I think there's been a credibility piece, but it's getting to the point. I've called AI ops the angry teenager on a couple of these sort of conversations.
That's a great one.
Because it is shouting and saying, hey, look at me, this is great, I've got all the answers, and the rest of all the adults in the room are going, you'll learn, son, you'll learn, and it's and I think it's moving beyond that now. I do think it's getting beyond its sort of teenage angst years, and it is that, and we talk about observability. and it's another area where potentially I think vendors will muddy the water about what observability really
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
And we've mentioned previously, it might upset the network performance management people because they've got a view about what observed data is versus event data. Observed data is what actually happens. It's what's passing up and down the wire. Whereas, other data, machine data, is what people decide they want to put into the event logs. So, there was an issue there. But the reality here is that, observability has become the sort of mantra, if you like, of the application developers, I think, and the DevOps people,
Yes.
who really have struggled, I think, in the interim period to get that end-to-end visibility. Because obviously, when you talk about the network and you talk about, even server management itself, if it all resides within a public cloud, how much control do you have over that? And therefore, they've had to approach observability from the point of, they've had to approach things from the point of view, can I observe what's happening to my application, not just at the application code level, but, what's happening out as it goes through the network and to, becomes the digital experience management at the far end. So I think it's given the APM people a different perspective on what they've got to provide to people, and you can come up then with it. So if you're looking at a sort of an overarching sort of umbrella term for the challenge of the environment of IT operations, I'd say AIOps over observability every day of the week. But if you're a DevOps person, in continuous integration, continuous development, then observability might be more your cup of tea, I suppose, would be the way to put it. But coming at it from a purely IT ops point of view, then AI ops rather than observability, I guess.
Sure. And also the I mean, my definition of it is really from the actual terms, not exactly what the technology or the solutions are. And that's hence why I've kind of always said, observability.
Yeah.
But we may be able to call a truce and say hybrid IT management, which I think is the way you put it. I also like that. So we may be able to perhaps use that as a way forward between us. But I'm sure the debate will continue.
I wish I had more market power than I actually do, because I've been trying
That'd be great, wouldn't it?
for about 2 years now, and I'm sanguine about it. I'd love it to be, but it's AI ops seems to be gaining traction, I think, but we'll see.
Okay, so and also the reports. I mean, we're not going to be able to do the report sort of justice in terms of covering it all, and this is obviously not the intention of this particular tool. But you do talk about the sort of the growing, the exponential growth of the vendor landscape with new startups coming in, as you said, focusing more on specific things like observability versus having to kind of try to encompass everything as per the sort of the more traditional vendors in that space. And those vendors, as you said, the startups also being focused in particular areas versus having to, and that only being their only sort of marketable business. That's their only solution they have, versus maybe more traditional vendors where they sell hardware or other data center related stuff, and systems management and sort of observability, whatever it happens to be, one of the other things that they bolt on as well. And that's kind of the change, I think, in the landscape that we're seeing. Now, as you said, other aspects of the report include things like market description. So you guys go through sort of a laying out of the scene, definitions of all these terms that we've kind of talked about, and the players in that space. And again, if any sort of vendor is actually looking at this and they're not mentioned in the report, don't fret. Don't get too huffed, because the landscape is constantly changing. So your time will come. You will be added in, and I'm sure Paul will be more than happy to kind of get you into the report at some point, right?
We always set ourselves, any analyst sets himself up, or herself up to do a sort of vendor landscape, because it changes so fast. So absolutely, we will keep trying to update it, but it's an ever moving target, that one.
So Paul, let's move on to another section of the report where you mentioned classification. Now, you said this is actually based around a consultancy organization called Trace3, and it's kind of based on their charts. Why did you guys kind of choose Trace3's sort of definition and chart?
Well, straight off, I was struggling to get some sort of way of classifying and putting down on paper, something that made sense, because we've talked about in the past the way in which vendors now cover multiple areas of the IT operations management space. It really made it very difficult, to say if I'm an APM vendor or I'm a network performance vendor, actually they appear in 3 or 4 different places because they do other things as well. It got really difficult. So it was really coming back down to what are the jobs to be done? If you've heard the sort of Clayton Christensen term of jobs to be done, it was always one that appeals to me. And I was just talking to one of the vendors who'd been working with this, systems integrator in this space called Trace3 in the States. And I said, oh, they've got a really interesting way of looking at it. So I had a look and I thought, yeah, they do. So this idea of classifying it around systems of monitoring, i.e., all the data that you're capturing, whether it's from the wire or the machine data or agents, synthetics, etc. Systems of engagement, which is where I've tended to put AIOps. Systems of data, a really interesting one, in the sense we talk a lot about data, and the explosion of the amount of data. And actually what you're seeing is a company like Splunk as a data, data company, handles data analysis, becoming quite important in this space. And systems of record, which is, the old the old ITSM, the service management piece, actually, but you can look at CMDBs and sort of IT asset management all sits out in this space that you still need. Systems of automation, well, we've talked about that too, isn't it? That you absolutely need to have automation. And there are companies out there whose whole raison d'etre was automation, who've worked themselves back into this arena. And then systems of visualization. So, systems of visualization is what it is. It's like the old manager of managers, giving you that eye in the sky view. And if you actually then look at the vendors as if you like, where they start off or what is the main thing that they do, you quite quickly see that they are, there's a load of people in systems of monitoring because that's the reality of where life was. And it doesn't matter whether they were network, application, server, end user, whatever monitoring, they've got monitoring tools, and that's where the majority of them sit. You've got, the AIOps people sitting in the middle doing the system of engagement, which is engaging all that data and saying, right now, how do I engage with the service management people at the far end? So there's a sort of pass through from systems monitoring to systems of engagement to systems of record, with data, automation, and visualization being the sort of key enablers to make sure you can do something with it. And it really worked really well. When I started to put the vendors into those categories, it was a lot easier than trying to work out the multiple. And there's a chart in the report that really shows the old way that the analysts generally, including Bloor, have tried to categorize these in the past. And you get multiple entries for vendors, and vendors getting really upset because they're not in this sector or that sector. And this just seemed a much simpler, easier way around the jobs to be done.
Sure. And there's always going to be sort of some kind of overlap with that. Now, in the actual report itself goes into a lot more depth, and obviously, like I said, we're not going to be able to cover everything. But you guys kind of do things like, the sort of the rapid expansion and broadening of functions of all the tools that the vendors are actually providing in their solutions. You also talk about sort of, you offer scenarios. So kind of, this company was doing this, and this is kind of what they're using. Focus around sort of public cloud and how does that kind of fit in with their functionality and tooling, and certainly draw some conclusions on that. So we'll kind of leave that for the readers really to go off and get on the report. I did want to just briefly touch on future trends, because there's a section that you mentioned that, and quite rightly, there's lots of sort of good stuff that's being mentioned in that that you discussed, which I think is quite good to probably highlight. So again, things like observability, the sort of shift left approach to kind of identifying problems and fixing problems, before they become sort of major events. So just talk a little bit about that sort of idea of shift left.
Yeah, as the world has moved towards a cloud implementation of IT, whether that's public, private or hybrid or whatever, but certainly public cloud, less and less of the control of the underlying infrastructure has been within the control of ITOps. It's passed away to the public cloud providers. It's gone somewhere else. And therefore, any idea that they can have a level of control over what's happening in their infrastructure has sort of disappeared to an extent. And therefore, the focus has got to be on ensuring that the code that ends up, in the application and in the infrastructure to start with is as good as you can possibly make it. Therefore, you've got to, IT has been, quite a cottage industry for many, many years. Every time we think we're getting a level of industrialization, some new technology comes along and throws everything up in the air again. And we go back to a sort of cottage industry, everybody focusing in their own little workshops doing things. And actually, I think you need to get to this sort of sense of a production line, which DevOps has got to an extent, the whole CI/CD piece. But what that drives is a need to ensure that the code you're writing in the first place is as good as it can be. And therefore, this whole shift left, this whole idea of the site reliability engineer, who's now got this sort of responsibility for ensuring that when it hits, when you put it out into the wild, the chances of it going wrong are much, much less than they used to be. Because if you don't, if we use some of the older, if we use the sort of I'll fix it when it goes wrong approach, which is where an awful lot of IT used to be, in a cloud environment, the impact on businesses will be horrendous.
Sure. And you also touch on things like open source tools. So a lot of the sort of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or CNCF, projects are in there as well. So things like Prometheus, Grafana, FluentD, OpenTelemetry. Those you see also as perhaps a backbone to some of the sort of more newer vendors coming online?
Yes, absolutely. And even some of the older ones too. If you actually look at the multi-cloud management capabilities of IBM rely very heavily on a lot of those tools that you're seeing there. And so it's their ability to pull that all together into a coherent whole, rather than the challenge with everything moving so fast for everybody is, do I develop myself, or do I take these tools, from a sort of open source environment? And we're seeing increasingly, these tools becoming the bedrock of the vendor solutions that you're seeing. It does also mean that if you are a really competent IT operations environment with really good in-house skill sets, you can skirt that and go straight to these tools to build it yourself if you want to. Now, how many people can do that? Different question. But they're there. And yes, so when you're talking to some of the big vendors, they won't always tell you exactly what tools they're using underneath, but open source is pretty much a foundation for a lot of what we see inside this space now.
Indeed. And you touched on multi-cloud management. Now, that is definitely a thing. That's definitely happening. But maybe that's something we can cover in a future talk, because I think there's a lot of sort of ground to cover there. But certainly one of the sort of strands of that I've seen sort of coming out is where vendors, whether they're sort of public cloud providers or actually just some of the vendors that you've mentioned in the report, are actually offering Kubernetes multi-cluster management, if you like. So it doesn't matter where your Kubernetes is, we will manage it for you. We'll do the observability and all the things that it needs for you from one pane of glass, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting in the sense that you do get the sense that the big three hyperscalers have been dragged a little bit kicking and screaming to this particular party, that they're not.
Noticed that.
And Kubernetes, and obviously Google's relationship with the whole Kubernetes program, means that they're probably further ahead than the other two in terms of genuine multi-cloud management. But obviously it goes beyond simple, Kubernetes. It goes into capacity management. It goes into, cost optimization. There's a whole series of things within multi-cloud management, and security within there that I think will come into play. If there are particular things within a hyperscaler's environment that are so critical to your business that you need to go down that route, I wouldn't over stress about vendor lock-in, etc. But the reality is that if you look at things like AWS Outposts, that's not really about multi-cloud management, and Anthos is a lot better from Google, but really when you compare it to what some of the multi-cloud management tools that are starting to appear, and I would classify IBM in that score, is it's a completely different world. So there's too many gotchas still with using the tools from the hyperscalers, but it may be it's worth your while doing so.
Yeah, and like I said, I think there's probably a decent amount of detail in there that we can maybe cover in a future talk.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I really appreciate your time today. It's been a really great talk. Really enjoyed going through and exploring AIOps and observability and discussing some of the contents of the report. As we said, we're not going to be able to do the entire report justice. There's lots more there for people to go and look at. So just again, just to reiterate, how do people kind of get hold of the report itself?
Well, as I say, we'll give you a link to put on your site so they can see exactly where to get at it. But if they want to go straight to bloorresearch.com, all one word, bloorresearch.com, and look at the research tab, you'll find the report there. As a new one, it should appear fairly readily for you. There's a quick sign up. But that sign up, which is only your email address, will give you access to all the body of research that's on the website, covering infrastructure, data, and security particularly, but also things like broader things like future of work. We're quite heavily into future of work now, so there's some issues we're getting involved in there too. So some interesting stuff, hopefully, to have a look at. Feel free to use it on as a personal use basis.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, again, appreciate your time today, Paul. It's been really good. I've learned so much. Yeah, and hopefully we can do another talk fairly soon. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and for giving me the opportunity. Cheers.
Thank you for watching this talk. If you enjoyed the content, please comment, share, like, and subscribe. See you next time.